Okay. So today we are talking to Paul Lysaker. He is a clinical psychologist at the VA Medical Center in Indianapolis and a professor of clinical psychology in the Department of Psychiatry at Indiana University School of Medicine. We are discussing specifically his paper entitled Social Dysfunction in Psychosis is More Than a Matter of Misperception, Advances from the Study of Metacognition, and this was published in 2021. So thank you for talking with us today. Just so that people can get to know you a little bit as a researcher, could you tell us how you got into studying clinical psychology and like what your main questions are as a researcher?
Well, I got interested in psychology midway through undergraduate studies at Kenyon College in Ohio. And I was particularly taken with the idea that sort of the basic quality of a person's sense of self changes when people experience certain forms of severe mental illness. And I got interested in how that could happen. How could a sense of self change? And also, how could it recover? What could happen that would promote the recovery of a sense of self? And this is something I also directly observed while doing my earliest training in clinical psychology at a small clinic in Canton, Ohio.
Okay. So what led you to do both work at a university level as well as something like the VA?
So the VA was especially appealing to me because it is one of the few settings in North America where people can do both clinical research as well as clinical work. Mm-hmm. So it's essential to my career has been the really remarkable opportunity to do formal research, but then to also meet with people in real life clinical settings. And the ambition is that the ideas, as thoughtful or precious as they are really tested out. These are research ideas, are really tested out when meeting with real life unique people. And the question is, do these ideas really help that person in the room at that moment? And then the two things change each other. Clinical practice is changed by research, but research questions are also really put to a particularly difficult and intense test by having the experience of meeting with real life people. And this is something I've been able to do at a VA setting.
Yeah, I can really see how research could be grounded by something like actually seeing the people they affect, and it really drives you, I'm sure.
Sure. I mean, as a simple illustration, we could study a particular phenomena that's related to a certain type of mental illness. And it could make complete sense as you talk with your colleagues. The research numbers could all come together in a beautiful way. But what happens when you sit with a real life human being?
Yeah, that's definitely, and that's, what most researchers are working for is the actual human being behind the phenomena. So that, I mean, it's great to see someone actually working with the people. That's really, that's, so specifically about your paper a little bit, the title of your paper talks about psychosis and how this is metacognition has affected psychosis. Can you describe just generally what is meant by psychosis in a clinical setting?
Sure. So it's an evolving term. People continue to think differently about it in different settings, both in North America, but also in Asia and Europe. I think in general, it refers to a really profound interruption in the trajectory of a person's life. A person's life is interrupted and things that were previously becoming are lost. and that's associated with some kind of alteration in basic kind of cognitive processes. And this could include odd or unusual beliefs or sensory experiences, but also difficulties organizing, thinking, seeing how stuff fits together, alterations in the ability to make sense of internal experience, and ultimately to figure out how you wanted to direct your own life.
Okay. What are some like diagnosed illnesses that have psychosis as a component?
Sure. So psychosis can appear in many particular diagnoses, and it remains really controversial whether these specific diagnoses are truly unique entities. But schizophrenia is the most commonly diagnosed psychotic disorder. Schizoaffective disorder refers to someone who experiences both episodes of depression or mania along with schizophrenia. Bipolar disorder and major depression, as well as post-traumatic stress disorder, can also have elements of psychosis, as could a range of other disorders as well.
Okay, so these things can have elements of it, but not necessarily be defined by psychosis as the like main.
Sure.
Oh, okay, interesting. Didn't know that. Okay, so the major aspect of your paper is looking at social dysfunction in psychosis, and specifically, obviously, the role of metacognition. So can you describe what is metacognition and how that is opposed to social cognition and how it's additive to it, and how these deficits actually affect people with psychosis and like in their
Sure.
learning?
Sure. So maybe I'll say something first about social dysfunction. So one thing that appears in the literature is if you interview people with psychosis, and this can include people with schizophrenia or severe forms of bipolar disorder or depression or trauma-related disorders, that they report feeling like they don't really belong to their larger community, that the motives, the thoughts, the wishes of other people may be foreign, and that they feel a sort of fundamental lack of sense of connection. People don't feel like they're part of the bigger human community, as I mentioned, and social exchanges sort of fall away and people feel profoundly isolated and alone. In fact, when you ask recovering persons, what's the most important thing to you? They say to feel connected again, to feel like I matter to other people and like I have some place in the world. So the question that emerges, how do we account for this lack of place in the world? And I'll tell you some of the simpler approaches to it, and then I'll get to the first thing, which is what is metacognition. So one approach is to say, well, there are deficits in social cognition. In other words, there may be problems for people with psychosis in recognizing correctly thoughts and emotions in other people or intentions. So presumably with intact social cognition, I might look at you and say, well, you seem interested or curious, or I might think you're bored or unhappy. And if I have good social cognition, those guesses are relatively accurate. Metacognition, though, goes beyond that. So metacognition refers to a series of processes, not by which I just notice what's happening correctly or not, but how I fit information together, how I discern the relationships between different pieces of experience and form a bigger picture of who I am and who other people are. So with intact metacognition, I may or may not guess correctly that you're bored or excited, but I get a bigger picture of who you are, what your purposes are, why you're doing what you're doing, how you relate to the people around you. And also with metacognition, I also am able to form a bigger picture of who I am, how I relate to other people, what my larger purposes in life are. It gives me this unique sense of who I am.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, what's going on and how I want to manage what's going on, both my challenges and lack of challenges. So the paper suggests that deficits in metacognition may be the most parsimonious explanation for why persons with psychosis struggle to make sense of social experience. In other words, it isn't merely that I don't make correct guesses about you, but I'm not forming a bigger and importantly, an evolving picture of you. So if I make a guess about you, right or wrong, that is in some ways not the full picture, because it's also important that my ideas about you change as you change.
Okay, so is something like metacognition something that's learned through experience, or is it something innate that we have and that through a process of psychosis we may lose?
It is most, I mean, it has to be a complex, multi-determined phenomena. It involves all sorts of brain activity. People with profound brain injuries obviously lose the ability to integrate information and make sense of things. Mm-hmm. People with alterations in basic brain processes and schizophrenia may have similar experiences. But other things influence this as well. Certainly, this is something we do early in our lives with our caretakers. We make sense of what our parents need or our caretakers need, and we make sense of what we need as from them. This also happens in our peer relationships. It happens when we hang out with our friends as we're growing up. It happens as we form new relationships. And one thing that's important is this process also always is intersubjective. It doesn't just happen in a small space in my brain.
Right.
There's no little you sitting inside of your head in some chair, pulling levers, making decisions, nor is there a little tiny me inside of my head making decisions. But we interact, and the ideas we form with one another become the basis of how we think about ourselves. So intersubjectivity is essential. Mm-hmm. There is shared experience between us that's essential. And so it could be that if intersubjectivity is threatened, we stop forming rich ideas about ourselves. It could be if brain functioning is compromised, we stop doing this. It could be if we experience terrible trauma, if we are hurt profoundly, well, during our lives by other people, that this also changes as well. And maybe one thing I will say is that the evidence that we don't form these ideas about ourselves in our head alone can be found in people who think they're funny when no one else does. So I don't know in your setting if anyone ever thinks they're funny and no one else does, but if it's true, it's like not a good thing. But we don't also decide on our own if we're empathic or non-narcissistic. Our senses, this sort of integrated sense of ourselves and other people, is always formed with other people, which is to say there's ultimately never one correct view of another person, but there are multiple forming views that are more or less adaptive as we form collaborative bonds with people.
Yeah, so that kind of actually almost answers my next question is, since metacognition is something that is formed with experience, that something like previous marginalization or being of a lower socioeconomic class or even racial class that's marginalized might compound these issues.
Yeah, sure. If the people around me are continuously forming deeply stereotyped and marginalized ideas about myself, that can only be a barrier to my having a rich and full sense of myself and my purposes and place in the world. Certainly, it erodes my chance for a place in the world if I'm marginal. I'm only allowed a particular corner and blocked from certain essential things.
Yeah, so it could aid in like what we see with mental illness, where the severity of mental illness in socioeconomic classes is increased, or in
Sure, and stigma is everywhere for people with serious mental illness. They're continuously referred to in the media as dangerous or incompetent.
Yeah.
There's also positive stigma where mentally ill adults are sort of treated as if they're cute or like large children, which again marginalizes them and doesn't give the full opportunity for joint reflection about them as complex beings.
Yeah.
Who really are no different than anyone else.
Yeah, that's an interesting dichotomy. I didn't think about the like positive effect and negative effect. So one thing that you talk about in this is something like merit, and you discuss it as a type of treatment for people with metacognitive deficits. Can you briefly discuss what merit is and how it can aid in treatment of psychosis?
Sure. So the merit is an integrative set of practices. So a person who does psychotherapy, this is meant to help them emphasize and de-emphasize certain aspects of their practice so as to be able to think with people about their challenges and possibilities and assist people with significant psychiatric challenges to make sense of those challenges and possibilities and decide how to live with them. So it's defined by core practices which are respectful for the autonomy and agency of the person and ultimately promote reflection, again, about what's happened to this person in their life. And that could involve reflection about racial or economic inequality. It could involve reflection about comfort with the sick role. It could involve reflection about the meaning of symptoms or changes in cognition or profound loss.
Okay, so it's an introspective form. That's interesting. So how, on a more general scale, how do these types of therapies get developed and tested? Because everyone's heard of all these different types like CBT and all the different types, but it's really hard to say how these are fully tested.
So merit is particularly ambitious. We're not trying to create yet another acronym therapy, but we would like to have a set of practices that if you're a CBT therapist might tell you what aspects of your practice are most important for promoting recovery and which aspects of your practice could be dangerous or counterintuitive. This applies as well for people who practice psychodynamic or humanistic therapy, Gestalt therapy, more moral or social therapies, etc. But it's meant to identify what enables a connection to form between a therapist and a recovering person, such that that human being, the recovering person, can again think about their challenges, decide how to manage them, and make sense. It also tries to define these in clear ways, so it isn't just sort of broad, general things that sound good, but you could tell whether or not a therapist is in fact doing these sets of things. And one of the ways we test this is we do these sessions, we record the sessions, then we ask how often people are doing these merit elements and which merit elements appear to be the most essential for change. In other words, if you look at the sessions where patients report the greatest level of change, what elements are happening more frequently than others?
So is this sort of testing, oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay, is this sort of testing something that's happening in the VA where you work specifically?
This is a colleague in Israel, Ilani Hassan Ohayan, who has a trial ongoing. We do have trials at the VA as well as local mental health centers going on as well. So basically, I mean, the way this gets tested is one goes into a clinic, a real life clinic, you have to see real life patients. And the first question is whether or not you can do the therapy. The second question is, will people accept it? And the third is, will they demonstrate meaningful changes that are recognizable? And ultimately, are those relatively more robust compared to other approaches?
Okay, so it's adding on to existing forms of therapy and not trying to like reinvent the wheel.
Well, yeah, because many of the key things are not reinventing the wheel, but what is new is the idea that people can differ in their ability to create complex ideas about themselves. And the implication is that people with the most acute forms of serious mental illness still have ideas about themselves and others, but those ideas are fragmented. They're not put together. And merit enables us to join with people with these and think about these fragmented experiences and begin to create more complex ones. So merit's singular contribution is the idea that we can quantify the extent to which people form integrated versus fragmented ideas, and then use that to track progress.
Okay, so this sort of quantification could be something that could be applied to people who suffer from mental illness but don't necessarily have a level of psychosis, but just have other social fragmentation.
Sure. Yeah. I think this is something that could apply to people across many conditions who are struggling to form a complex idea of who they are and what their place in the world is, who are struggling to understand the larger purpose in their life and how they fit into the larger human condition.
Okay. Yeah.
It enables interventions then to change as metacognitive level changes. So as people improve or experience decrements in metacognitive capacity, it allows for interventions to shift and meet the person essentially where they are in terms of forming ideas about themselves.
Okay, so one thing that I just realized I didn't touch on in the beginning is how can strong social relationships aid in the treatment of mental illness? We talk about not having those, but how can actually having those really aid in this treatment?
Well, a meaningful connection between two people enables reflective activities. So it's no different than if you or I meet with old friends or family, meet new people and have intimate personal talks. We're forming and reforming and evolving our ideas about ourselves, others, and the world, and also how we want to respond to and deal with them. It's never just an abstract idea. You mentioned the word introspection. It isn't merely an abstract idea in my head, but it's a living idea. How do I respond to challenges? How do I deal with things that are emerging? Opportunities, as well as things that are disappointing or frustrating to me, losses. So the idea is that merit enables a deep sort of bond to take place in psychotherapy where these kind of reflections can take place. And the advantage of psychotherapy is many of these reflections for people diagnosed with psychosis are deeply painful. It isn't merely the recognition, aha, I have strength, ability, that's a part of it, but there's also often profound loss, disappointment, embarrassment, and a terrible sense of aloneness and alienation. And that can be understood in these deep social relationships, in these intersubjective moments, made sense of, and people can find ways to live with these challenges that are fully meaningful and enable a really recovery to take place. And that's regardless of the acuity of the challenges that a person with mental illness is facing.
Yeah, so it's pretty applicable throughout. Okay. So just to wrap things up a little bit, we generally ask if you could change one thing within your field of work, what would it be?
I think one of the things that we're working to move away from is sort of the expert, someone who's not the person with mental illness stepping back and making sense of the challenges of the person, but instead moving towards a joint set of reflections about what these realistic challenges are and what realistically represents health. So rather than a quote expert informing the person or trying to teach the person what to do, it's not a joint set of reflections. So in standard practice, unfortunately, it's often the case that I'm the psychologist, therefore I'm the expert. So I tell the patient with mental illness, this is what you need to do. And then I give you practices or exercises to do. And that seems naive and relatively dangerous as far as keeping people in a marginalized position. So we would hope for the emergence of collaborative bonds in which also the complexity of human suffering is made manifest and is not reduced to a set of highly specific and artificial difficulties, which we love these artificial difficulties because we think we can solve them, but they don't really match the complexities of human suffering.
Yeah, and that makes, I mean, because a lot of people nowadays talk about personalized medicine, but when they describe that, they mostly are talking about like genetic differences of people and doing like pharmacological differences. But this sounds like personalized medicine in psychology.
Yeah, so it's personalized in that you or me are the collection of how many billion neurons, how many millions of social moments, how many hundreds and thousands of years socially. And personalized, it involves trying to form some idea of who we really are and what we're really doing and where we're going. And incredibly complex. It doesn't mean we have to throw out the other knowledge,
right?
But it remains profoundly naive to think that that can be simplified to a set of exercises or simple calculations.
Yeah, that work for everyone. But yeah, no, that is a very good. It's very good. Hopefully that will change. You know,
we'll see. It's so alluring and seductive to have simple solutions.
Yeah. Yeah, well, thank you so much for talking with us. It was very informative, and I think a lot of people will get a lot from this.
Oh, thanks so much. And for those of you watching, feel free to shoot me an email if you'd like to learn more.